Ori Rabinowitz is an Israeli scholar and a former journalist. She's also the author of the book Bargaining on Nuclear Tests. Ori, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your book looks at the significance of the 1969 American-Israeli nuclear pact. Tell us, what is significant about that?
It's significant in several ways. First of all, I would argue that it's the heart of the bilateral relationship between Israel and America, a relationship that since 1969 grew stronger. And these days, actually, we're seeing challenges and we're seeing the relationship being tested. As we all know, here in D.C., Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to come here in early March, and it raised considerable tensions. But going back to 1969, I would argue that it was probably the strongest link in the chain that led to Israel and America building a special relationship with each other.
And it has implications moving forward for all other nuclear bargains?
It does have implications because in the Israeli case, the underlying rationale that, and it was stated in a memo composed by Kissinger in July 1969, that he said, in this case, public knowledge is almost as dangerous as possession itself. So if you follow this logic, you'd come to the conclusion that you might as well try to prevent this public knowledge of the said nuclear program. And interestingly enough, what I discovered doing my research was that a similar rationale was implied with the South African nuclear program and the Pakistani nuclear program in the early 80s, when then the Reagan administration realized that in a certain respect, the horses were out of the saddle, and these two countries have, in fact, a nuclear program. They decided that the second best thing to do was to reach some sort of an understanding that would prevent these two states from testing, because that would make it not public. It would prevent it from becoming public knowledge.
Mm-hmm. America and many of its allies talk about nuclear weapons in terms of non-proliferation. You make the point that geostrategic considerations can trump non-proliferation concerns. That's really interesting. Could you expand on that and how that occurs?
Yes, so absolutely. So it's right to a degree, but as a proper academic, of course, I have to qualify myself by saying that every U.S. administration up until this point has been opposed to the spread of nuclear weapons. But you had that opposition being expressed in different degrees. So President Carter, for example, was a much harder supporter of efforts to prevent that nuclear proliferation, compared with President Reagan and President Nixon. But Reagan and Nixon also did not want to see other countries develop nuclear weapons. It's not as if, I'm not saying that they did want to see Israel, for example, in the Nixon administration become nuclear. They just realized that it's what was about to happen. And the question was, so what policies are you about to apply? What are you willing to do? And I think that in the case of the Reagan administration, for example, the geopolitical considerations that applied to that era of the Cold War were extremely significant in what happened next. So with the Pakistani case, the Reagan administration wanted Pakistani's help in getting involved in Afghanistan and making sure that the Soviets did not win over Afghanistan. It was basically it revolved around arming the Mujahideen and battling that front of Soviet expansionism, what was called Soviet expansionism. And in South Africa, in the case of Southern Africa in general, there was an attempt to prevent what was perceived as a deepening Soviet intervention in the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the countries that bordered South Africa. And the understanding was that these two states played a significant role in these American attempts to prevent Soviet expansionism, etc., and that it was important to reach some sort of an accommodation on the nuclear agenda.
Mm-hmm. So, given all these considerations, a general consensus that more nuclear weapons isn't necessarily a good idea. On the other hand, there's always context and there are always other considerations. Flash forwarding to today and negotiations with Iran, what are the most salient messages or lessons, I should say, from your research and your book that apply to today's situation?
So I think it's a great question. And again, as the ardent academic that I am, I will again qualify by saying this. When we talk about Israel, Pakistan, and South Africa, we talk about three countries that became nuclear during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, they were also associated with America. They were on the American side. They had nothing to do with the Soviets. They weren't. Pakistan was nominally non-aligned, but it wasn't the case. It was very much in American spirit. The Cold War is over. That Cold War is over.
Cold War is over, yeah.
So the messages we take, we have to adjust them to our time. And here's what I think we can learn. We can learn that America, under certain conditions, is more than willing to reach nuclear bargains. It's important for America to try to limit nuclear proliferation. And even if it can't necessarily eliminate any kind of nuclear technology or the spread of nuclear technology, it is still important to limit the escalation or to have some sort of a control over the different rungs in which the nuclear actor is trying to climb up or climb down, depends on where you're looking at the nuclear ladder from. So I think what we can take from that is American willingness to reach said bargains, to try to accommodate different interests under a certain geopolitical constraints that exist, which are different today than those that existed during the Cold War, but are still there. America still is operating under geopolitical constraints. There are still external conditions. When you think about how to apply nuclear non-proliferation policies, you still take other things into account. And I think that current talks with the Iranians and the effort that we see being put in place by the Obama administration to reach some sort of a deal underlines this logic.
Final quick thought, and you've already made clear that you're going to be academically rigorous and not fall into punditry. So I'm going to ask for a prediction that you may want to pass on. But how do you see this unfolding, the negotiations with Iran? Do you see a positive result, or can this thing go south?
So I think the Obama administration has a vested interest in seeing a deal reached. I think that in terms of trying to reach a foreign policy success, they're in a bind because they can only basically use Cuba up until now. And I think there is a great motivation to add to the list something other than Cuba. That being said, it's not a guarantee that a deal will be reached. And we see huge forces that counteract that. Interestingly, I think that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coming visit to Washington might actually reach the opposite effect of what he originally wanted. And I'm Israeli, so when I say this, I use my perspective as an Israeli, as someone who follows the news. I think that Netanyahu very much wants to thwart a possible nuclear deal, which by default I believe he would see any nuclear deal. Which is too
lenient toward Iran's goals.
I think any possible nuclear deal would be seen by Netanyahu and his staffers as too lenient, and he would want to thwart that. But the current clash we see today with the Obama administration, with the Democrats on the Hill, I think it's counterproductive because it's actually weakening support in that cause. I don't think it strengthens it.
The law of unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.